Hello to you all. I'm Catarina Brandão, and I would like to welcome you to this panel discussion. We have here Professor Rosalind and Professor Lynn from National Centre for Research Methods in the UK. They are both co-directors of that center, and they are going to talk to us on innovations in qualitative research and topics, focusing research in families and sustainability, and secondary data analysis with large volumes of qualitative data. This panel will last 1 hour and a half. Professor Lynn and Professor Rosalind will give us a presentation, and they have prepared some dynamic moments, including interaction with the audience. And at the end, we will also have opportunity for other reflections and questions. So thank you so much for being with us, Professor Lynn, Professor Rosalind, and sharing with us your experience. Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, it's lovely to be speaking to you. I just want to tell you, to start the session off with, tell you a little bit about the National Centre for Research Methods, which we call NCRM for short. So it was established back in 2004. It was established by the UK's main research funder, which is the Economic and Social Research Council. And we were asked to become the focal point for research and training activities in social science research methods in the UK. And as you introduced us, Lynn and I are co-directors of the National Centre for Research Methods, and we're the lead qualitative researchers. Some of you might have been expecting 2 more of us from NCRM. We're very sorry not to have Emma Davidson with us, who is going to speak about researching public spaces, and Susie Weller, who is going to talk about using Skype for conducting interviews. But unfortunately, both of them have had to withdraw for personal reasons. So Lynn and I have, we hope we'll carry the session. We've redesigned it to focus on innovative methods and topics. And we're going to talk about researching families and sustainability and how to work with large amounts of qualitative data. And we're also going to be finding out about your own qualitative method skills. What I want to do is start off by telling you, though, about the qualitative research that's been taking place through the NCRM, because you might find it interesting. NCRM has got a vision. All organisations nowadays have to have a vision, and our vision is to provide this sort of integrated, cutting-edge centre of expertise where we're developing innovative research methods. And I've highlighted 2 of our overarching objectives, the ones that relate to methods development. So firstly, to advance methodological practice and innovation through this cross-disciplinary programme. And also, the third one is to ensure that the UK is recognised internationally for high-quality methodological research and training. So here I am, I'm pushing the international recognition for NCRM. Now, as part of these 2 main objectives in the methods field, we've commissioned research teams to undertake methodological research in important areas where there are gaps. And what I want to do is just briefly introduce you to some of the qualitative methods work that's going on in NCRM that might interest you. Now, the first is a project that is demonstrating the feasibility of conducting secondary analysis across using existing data from several qualitative longitudinal studies. And I won't say more about this project and the methods that it's developed, because that's what Lynn and I will go on to talk about later in the session. But if you visit this web page, You can find out information about the project. You can follow blogs by guest contributors who are also working with large amounts of qualitative or secondary data. And if you add your email address in the subscribe box, you'll receive notifications and updates of all new posts. If you are working with large amounts of qualitative data and you've got an idea, you've got a project that you'd like to share, then get in touch, because you might be able to write a blog for us. Now, this is another project that is run in our centre. It's the Pedagogy of Methodological Learning project, and it's promoting teaching development for advanced social science research methods. The project itself uses a variety of qualitative methods. We have interviews with a panel of international experts in research methods teaching. They've used diary methods and longitudinal analysis with researchers who are at different stages of their research careers. And there's been case studies of methodological and pedagogical innovation using video-stimulated recall and reflection by researchers. So they've created a typology of pedagogic approaches that social research methods teachers use, and that this typology can be used to give teachers insight into their practice that involves what strategies are they using, what tactics, and what activities are they using. So there's 4 main approaches that teachers use. One is active learning, one is experiential learning, there's student-led teaching, and there's collaborative learning approaches. So you can find out more about them on this project webpage. This is another research project. I mentioned it when I gave my talk yesterday. It's addressing how participatory action research approaches can engage with marginalised groups in research as co-producers of knowledge. And the researchers have combined walking methods and participatory theatre with migrant mothers and young people. And they've created this space for learning and exploring and sharing and documenting the processes of belonging and understanding and enacting citizenship. Now, they've developed a toolkit for training social researchers in participatory methods, so you can access that on their website. Another project is concerned with participatory methods that looks at visual methods, where the research participants are active in shaping the project as co-producers of visual knowledge. And that uses participatory mapping to explore the extent to which these methods are giving voice to participants and how those voices are understood by audiences. This is quite a new project, but if you visit their webpage, they'll be updating it. Now, this project on somatics is producing a set of tools for researchers to actually reflect on their body as a site of knowledge in ethnographic and other research methodologies. And they call it a somatics toolkit. So the researchers undertaking this project argue that the body can provide a source of mental and emotional support in what can be a challenging academic environment. So self-care of our bodies is important for us as researchers. And there are 3 elements to the toolkit that they've produced. One is a series of audio tracks that encourage ethnographers to focus on issues like exploring your physical intelligence, the dynamics of seeing and being seen, navigating your emotions and vulnerability, and doing an embodied literature review. They've also got a website with blog posts that are written by researchers from this somatic bodily perspective. And they also have a podcast series where researchers talk about the role of the body in their research and teaching. Now, that's just a sort of taste of some of the qualitative projects in particular that we run. As well as being a hub, though, for research projects that are sort of trying to push forward, develop groundbreaking methodologies, we've got a strong range of online, I feel like a salesperson, we've got a strong range of online resources they're there to help people who are interested in social science methods. So I'm going to just quickly run through some of the resources and some examples. So up there you can see the NCRM print service. That gives you access to methods books, articles, working papers, reviews, reports, presentations. You can download them. Some of the most popular ones are on how many qualitative interviews is enough, what is qualitative interviewing, using video for research, and anonymity and confidentiality. NCRM also has a podcast series, audio series that shares the latest methodological developments. A couple of examples from that are multimodal methods, apps for qualitative research, and creative methods. And there are also videos, which include recordings of methods presentations and online methods tutorial. And examples of the online recordings are research ethics, visual methods, narrative methods, and participatory research. And finally, on my sales pitch, NCRM also runs events. And I've highlighted two of our upcoming qualitative ones. Well, one's sort of qualitative, the other isn't so much. But so highlighted in yellow is a seminar. It's on the interface between social research methods, both qualitative and quantitative, the interface between that and automated algorithms. And it's taking place in London in November. And in the blue insert is an event that's looking at research, how you research sensibilities. So it's going to focus on relationalities between people, music, environment, and also Indigenous perspectives. And that's in December, that's in Manchester. So if you are interested to travel to the UK and attend these, they're free, you can just register on the NCRM website. I don't know if anybody has any questions before we move on. No, okay. So I'll go over to Lynn now. Oh, but before I do, I always forget this, I'm a useless salesperson. This is a journal that I edit. Yes. Yes, it publishes quantitative, qualitative, mix, visual, the whole lot. So if you, it's got if you're interested in these things, 2.11 impact factor, and we'd be very pleased to receive any submissions from you. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Right, so I'm going to now switch to something completely different with the help of shut that one, sorry. Yes. Okay, so, but before I do this, is it this one? My Portuguese isn't very good. Is it from the... That one?
Yes.
Okay. Good. No, that's fine. Right, so I'm going to, at 2 stages, ask you to interact with me. And the main one is not now, but I am going to sort of get you into the mode. So I want you to think your left hand is for research and your right hand is for teaching, okay? So I want you to go like this if you do any research that's connected to sustainability or issues of environment, meaning the natural world and its destruction, or climate change, any of those issues, if you do any research on any of those issues, yep. And if you do any teaching on any of those issues, your right hand. Okay, so if you look round the room, okay, now look round the room and see who's showing hands, okay? It's not very many of us, but it's some of us. Some people with one hand, some people with two hands. Okay, so I'm trespassing on your time to try to just have a brief interlude here, getting you to think with me and encouraging you to think about yourselves and your capacities as qualitative researchers for doing more research around issues about environment. Now, I'm a researcher of families and relationships. That's my primary topic. That's the thing that I do the most research on, and I have written about this, trying to get people to think about it in that topic area specifically. And I'm going to actually just remind you of some theoretical reasons why qualitative research in this topic area might be incredibly important. Okay, so I'm going to talk theory briefly in order to get you to be thinking method. So you have to do some of the thinking work. Okay, so I'm not got time to talk about definitions of sustainability. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to lecture to you about climate change. I'm sorry, I'm looking for glasses, but they're always right in front of you when you can't see them. And I'm going to take it for granted that you do not take a Donald Trump position, that you do understand that global capitalism is part of the problem in the way that it is exploiting environments, but also that globalization and the speed up of flows of people, of ideas, of things, of stuff, doesn't necessarily have to be hyper-destructive, and that there are ways that we could make this part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I'm also going to take it for granted that you understand that absolutely everything almost that we do has a carbon footprint, everything you purchase and consume, including the water that we drink. So I come from Scotland where it rains a lot, but actually I mainly drink from the tap, and it's already gone through filtering and pumping, and a lot of electricity, really a lot of electricity has been used in the process. And although we've got lots of windmill taking energy from the wind, actually fossil fuel burning is still a very significant component of the way that the water is cleaned and pumped. So I'm going to take it for granted you understand all of that, that you also understand that this is an issue of incredible inequality, that those of us in the rich world and those of us who are relatively well off in that world are contributing on generally much more to the harm, and at the same time much more protected from the harms. We are not the ones who are reaping the real problem, although we may be massively contributing to it. So Portugal as a country is slightly below the per capita, per head of population terms, but when you compare it with Ethiopia or Bangladesh, of course, it's in terms of how much we consume per person, it's very different. In my own country, the UK, is above the world average at the moment, and so on. So, and people's attitudes to all of this are very different, but how people, to have droughts or floods are a difficult thing for people anywhere, but actually if you are on the margins in terms of survival, there is no safety net, it can plunge you into catastrophe, absolute personal catastrophe, in a way that just doesn't happen for most of us in the rich world. Okay, so I'm taking all of that as for granted background context. And this book by Janet Boddy and others on the environment in the lives of children and families was a comparative piece of qualitative research that was comparing families in India and families in the UK, and speaking to people about what environment meant to them, as well as all kinds of environmentally consequential practices and so on. And I'm going to refer back to this piece of research on a number of occasions. Okay, so, and I'm not going to read this out, and I'm going to keep going because of time. So the theoretical approaches that I'm taking for granted are all ones that are completely familiar to you. I am sure. I'm just reminding you here in order to try to help encourage thinking around the really rather wide range of possible research agendas that there are for people in this room. So my starting point is that as a sociologist, I take it for granted that people are relational, that we are shaped by our relationships to a large extent, but we're also shaped by our natural world. And it's the ways that these interact that we're focusing on. So the psychologist James Gibson coined the term affordance, which is now used a lot when we speak about mobile phones, the internet having a particular affordance. In my country, there are very few trees in the highlands because sheep and deer overgraze. So sheep and deer live from eating grass. If they are overgrazing, no trees can grow. So they actually are modifying the natural environment in relation to humans in the way that we've placed them there in the environment. We as humans sometimes think of ourselves as having a habitus and a habitat. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, coins this term habitus to mean the predispositions that make who we are, that we developed in a particular social context. Not fixed forever. If our context radically changes, we can change, but some of it is sedimented and embedded in us very early on, almost literally embodied. Okay, so that's the kind of theoretical resources that I take for granted, but of course, our habitat doesn't afford us equal opportunities. We are shaping our environment, but not completely able to choose where we start. It's not of our making, we are of a particular time and place. But that doesn't mean, even if we feel entrapped, even if we feel we've got no room for maneuver, that there is absolutely none. We always have some possibilities of collective action and slight degrees of room for maneuver, although some of us have much more than others. And flipping from that to a specific example from qualitative research of how affordances might be translated through relationships in a relational world into different predispositions. Here's a piece of work, a qualitative study about parenting in the UK, comparing parents from different class backgrounds. And the author here is talking about how middle-class parents are communicating to their children a sense of entitlement and privilege, and the way that they talk about their children and their children's education communicates this. And in contrast to that, the way that working-class parents talk about their children emphasizes fitting in and team playing. So there's no explicit class reference here talking about Joel's risk of being bullied by somebody who's physically very skilled but academically backward, but there's a kind of suggestion of social class. And this is working class parents talking about their child, not nearly as privileging. And of course, these parents have got very different circumstances, very different sorts of social networks and capitals that they can call on when interacting with the school. So Joel has got an uncle who takes him to the museum, who's a historian, and so on. They can work part-time, help with his homework, and you know, it's just a completely different context from working long hours, not having a social network that's stuffed full of people with higher degrees, and never feeling confident that you could turn up at the school and be treated with respect, and that you could authoritatively suggest to the teacher something different for how Liam should be being treated. Okay, so all of that is just taken for granted, I think, in the way that I think about relationships, but it's relevant to these environmental issues because they are very much about how we think about the future and other people in distant places, and our sense of responsibility and our orientation to others. And the theoretical resources that I use assume that we are, and that I think you use too, that our inner dialogue about ourselves is shaped by our relational context. So these are all sort of theorizing modes that people here, I think, are very familiar with. So very briefly, relating that to sort of the global level, obviously in a context in which we are constantly connected and we have a backdrop of social media and mass media messages, how we are shaped is also responding to this backdrop. But I would argue always relationally filtered, always influenced by the embodied and the face-to-face. And some theorists have tried to talk about how there is a growing global culture, and maybe as if a kind of generalized other, a sense of how others think, is maybe becoming more globalized. So John Muir's World Society Thesis is the most obvious example of that, despite, you know, all kinds of counter-evidence. And he was very much emphasizing things like a human rights discourse, a scientific professional discourse, where the claim to do what you're doing is not about self-interest, but is supposed to be about a transcendent level of evidence and professional practice. But of course, that's also often ethnocentric and sometimes actually also masculinist. And, you know, we could critique this in various ways, but it's interesting to think with nevertheless. And people have tried to argue that some ways in which, for example, violence against women is very rapidly becoming socially unacceptable in some senses, at least when you look at it in survey research, is about cultural diffusion. But of course, the reality of qualitative research, when you look at it very carefully in detail, is that there is always much more going on than that, and that a human rights discourse, although it's been available widely, the way that it can possibly be deployed locally is very varied, and women activists have worked very hard to make it possible to make gains in different contexts and in different ways. So the diffusion is mediated through relationships and histories of local collective action, and it takes good qualitative research to show that. And the same sorts of qualitative thinking that goes into that kind of work, I think, could very much be deployed to talk much more about issues around sustainability and environment. It's the same sorts of sets of problems. So theorists who've been very more optimistic about the interconnections between imagining community both sort of discursively and in a a more embodied interactional way include Beck and Elias here talking about different sorts of ways in which we might be, as a world, becoming more interconnected and aware of interconnection and more sympathetic to strangers. And that kind of optimism, of course, maybe seems quite difficult in the present moment, both when we have a rise of right-wing forms of political movement in a number of states fueled by anti-immigration or fueling anti-immigration, and we are on the verge of catastrophe in terms of climate change. But nevertheless, it actually points to the need to do more thinking around what can make these possibilities actually realized. How can this be, as social scientists, how could we do more to be researching and understanding the processes that would make this a possibility? And in my own national context, John Urry has been very influential writing about climate change and about the ways in which the domestic lives and personal lives that we live are locked into global systems that make changes in practices very difficult. Both the systems of housing, the systems of transport, what he's calling the carbon military industrial complex. But personal relational lives are systems, they make systems, and they make capacities for collective action. And there is room for manoeuvre in thinking about how that manoeuvre could be realized through doing qualitative social research. So there's lots and lots of evidence about how the way our personal lives are locked into the problem. Through, we can talk about energy use at the level of our private lives. We could talk about food waste. We could talk about transport systems and the ways that our everyday personal lives are interlocked into all of those, and everyday practices of shopping and consumption and so on. And there's been bits of research done on all of those, including some quite good qualitative work, but there's a great deal more needs to be done to try to understand better both the ways in which people get the political will for collective action around these issues and the possibilities of moments of transition where practices can quite suddenly and rapidly shift. And both of these are very real, possible ways of trying to advance, becoming part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So here's back to Body and colleagues' piece of research about people talking about the environment, somebody justifying the conventional suburban practice of middle class and affluent dwellers in my country, where people want to live in nice leafy areas, either in the country or the leafy suburbs, and then they travel in cars through more deprived areas where they contribute to the particulates that give children asthmas, and they're also driving through areas where there are much higher deaths for children by motor accidents and so on, when they travel to work typically. But Rosie's got a stunning view from her classroom, and she's benefiting from the sense of well-being. But that, alongside that kind of free rider way of thinking, there are also lots of other more optimistic pieces of research talking about times when people do make changes and thinking about the kinds of discourse and dialogue that people have in their everyday lives around these issues, often also tensions. So, you know, my daughter is very environmental. She's all green, very green. She says car driving is the new smoking. And the kind of moral discourse around this is often one of conflict and people feeling put down by others who are taking what they perceive as a more moral stand and moral high ground, and not then fully coming on board, so because they feel put down. So there's quite a lot of interesting research around those kinds of dynamics, sometimes coming on board, sometimes not. And this is an example of the kind of mirror opposite, maybe, or not opposite exactly, but a different take on the same issue about the women driving the four-wheel drive car that consumes more fuel because she lives in the leafy suburb and it's going to snow. This is somebody who's choosing to live in the city, who's choosing not just for environmental reasons, but is consciously thinking about the environment as part of it. The research literature itself is kind of documenting moments of people taking what would maybe be more hopeful directions in terms of our future as a planet. So personal life is about all sorts of things, but it's cultural transmission and diffusion, it's carriers of social practice, and therefore also possibilities for switching social practice. It's about supporting or not conditions to strangers, imagined community with others, or hostility to outsiders. We can do all of those things in personal life. We can do either. So asking what's the conditions that enable political energy for common good, political energy for capacity for collective action. What are the conditions that enable switching to lower carbon social practices, or what are the conditions that enable taking pleasure in low carbon practices rather than seeing them as stigmatized because of poverty or morally snooty, snobbish, taking high ground and therefore to be challenged. Those research questions, I think, are ones that we could all do more to contribute to. Okay, so I'm stopping that bit there, and apologies for trespassing on you in this sense, but I wonder if there's any immediate reactions or comments. Okay. Okay. Right, I'll leave it with you. So now to something, back to the more expected agenda. This one. Okay. Okay, so under the auspices of the National Centre for Research Methods, Rosalind and myself, along with Emma Davidson and Susie Weller, are or have developed this method that we call breadth and depth method. And those of you who were at Christine Silver's talk might see some ways in which this also to some extent connects with that. This is a method, it's a method in the sense of a whole kind of methodology, but also we are working on pedagogical aspects of this. So we're also thinking about pedagogy through an associated project where we're thinking about how to teach this method. And so we are thinking about our general approach and our strategy. And Christine was using the word strategy to mean, I think, the sort of overarching research design kinds of questions. And so that's going to be relevant as well to what we talk about. So it's a 4-step process. But maybe before speaking about that, I'll just say a couple of things about why. So our starting point is the fact that there is now a very large amount of qualitative data that has been archived. And in the UK in particular, if you get a grant to do any funding for funded work for qualitative research, the main funder requires you to archive the data. So there is a very significant archive now of qualitative research. And to some extent, that means it's got a kind of quality control about it. So because it's been given public funding. So there is an archive of what you would hope was reasonable quality research. And that resource is underused, and it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for asking new questions of the data, of bringing the data together in new ways, and for perhaps being able to generalize more from the data, not in any statistical sense, but in the sense of dealing with different kinds of cases and looking at the same thing in different circumstances, a wider range of circumstances. So we began a methodological task through a substantive focus. So we were interested in a particular set of questions around practices of care and intimacy and their change over time and gender issues, gender differences and changes over time. And we also were familiar with a particular set of archives, the Timescape archives, because both Ros and I had worked on these projects. So it's a set of projects that were brought together, all looking at aspects of family life, care and intimacy, over time and in different generations, a set of 7 projects that were brought together. So the metaphor that we quite quickly came up with, and I suspect it was Ros that named it first, of archaeology, helped us to describe what we were doing and the way that we were moving back and forward between these different levels of trying to get some kind of overview of the data. So we're talking about more data than you would ever normally tackle as a qualitative researcher. Not necessarily the scale that is meant by big data, although maybe it could be that scale. But in our case, we've got 7 different projects in an archive, each with multiple sweeps of data. So a very large number of files, more than you could comfortably read. So we're talking about overviewing, not when you can't use the normal conventions of qualitative research. And we were thinking of that as equivalent to the aerial survey of archaeology, then doing something more detailed, some kind of more detailed mapping, then some sort of more preliminary analysis, which might send you back to this level before or even the level before. And then eventually doing some in-depth conventional analysis. So that's the process that we're going to describe. So I'm talking about the first 2 steps. So in the first step, when you're looking at archive data, you usually, if it has been archived properly, you should have some sorts of metadata. So you should have some information about what is in the data set, about often you might have additional material that's been deposited, like the interview guides. It will tell you who exactly was in the sample, something about who was in the sample, how many files there are, what sort of permission has been given for you to be a researcher looking at it again, what a case was, what the unit of analysis was, how many sweeps of data there were, exactly where it was done, when it was done, and so on. So actually you need to do an audit of all of that to try, because what you're trying to do is to find something that fits, assuming you're starting with your research question, you know why you're interested in something and what you're interested in, and you're trying to find relevant data and bring an assemblage together from all of the available archive material that you can lay your hands on. So you need to do this kind of auditing to try to decide, and hopefully there'll be keywords that you can search, and you need to kind of you need procedures. All of this is laboursome. You need procedures to kind of audit. And this is the sort of thing that we did. We actually ended up, although this was already supposedly a very good archive with a lot of metadata and good management, we ended up renaming all of the files and doing a lot of work on it because it wasn't quite laid out in the way that we wanted. And so we did a lot of reformatting. Some of the programs that you subsequently want to use will only take text data, plain text. So then you have to reformat all of the files. You want to be, because we are qualitative researchers and we're very keen to make sure we could always get back to the original data and knew immediately what we were looking at. We wanted the file names to be in a particular format and so on. So we did a lot of work with reformatting to help us with this. And then we brought it together into a corpus of data that was not following exactly the way that the project was originally set up. So these projects were about particular topics. So that previous slide was showing you that there was a project on siblings. Well, we wanted to organize the data by cohort, by the kind of year span in which people were born, and by gender because of the interest that we had. So we were taking files from different projects according to when people were born and whether they were male or female, and putting them in a corpus that was organized differently. So we'd assembled the data set already informed by these principles. We had a topic, we were interested in honouring qualitative method principles. We were also interested in our questions were about advancing theory and strengthening the possibilities of generalisation, because we were trying to build on some of those debates about convergence in between men and women and individualisation and so on. So we had a rationale for what we were doing. And then once you've got your corpus, the next step is to start using text mining. Now, we don't like the term mining, because for qualitative researchers, it suggests digging deep. But actually, these text techniques that we are drawing on are very much about surface. They're not really about depth as you understand it as a qualitative researcher, because what most of the techniques do is they break text into tokens, often words. They're doing things like counting frequencies. They're looking at collocations of words or concordance, the immediate proximities, the way words are clustering. And sometimes they're measuring keyness in the sense of how frequently a word appears in one particular, however you've defined it, set of texts versus a much larger corpus. Or you might compare, for example, in our project, how the older generation use a particular word versus the younger generation, or older generation men versus younger generation men. How key is a word in one versus the other. So there's many different softwares you can use, and you would be able to name multiple ones, and much of this comes from linguistics. So linguistics have been interested in word language, ways words are used far longer than some of us, and some of them are free, some of them are open source, some of them are commercial products that are not totally transparent about exactly what algorithms they're using and how they're doing it. And we have played around with several of these methods and trialed them. And we're not recommending any particular one product, but trying to encourage this as a method, as a set of steps. So to take an example, love, the word love seemed to come up a bit differently when we were trying to do keyness searches. In fact, it didn't turn out to be statistically significant. And when you move to the next level, which Roz is going to talk about, and you actually go in and go back to the text and look at how love is used, you can find, we love all sorts of things, of course. It's not necessarily about practices of care and intimacy. You can love the stars, you can love getting things, you can love all sorts of stuff. And we, in the end, rejected it. But you can see this. I'm going to hand over to Roz to talk about the next couple of steps. You can see how you might have to go back and forward to then decide where to move to our next step of a shallow test bit.
Thanks. Okay, so that's the first two steps. You've got a massive amount of qualitative data that you can't possibly deal with, and you load it into whatever package that you're going to do the search of keyness into. And that's a breadth. You're getting this breadth overview of this massive data set that you've got. And as Lynn said, we used somebody else, lots of different projects. We brought them all together. And then that's very broad overview. It's not what qualitative researchers do. So we're now going to start moving on. We've got this overview, but how do we move on into getting some sense of the quality of this data? These are steps 3 and 4. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to use an example of an analysis that is based not on love, as Lynn had said, but on the keyword home. Now, love was one of the words that was identified as a keyword in step 2. So was home. And it had a significance of meaning across all the massive amount of data we were dealing with. I mean, massive in qualitative terms. And looking at it further, we could see that there was a relationship between the word home and the word moved. So we identified, looking at the intersection of those two words, that was worth investigating. And we had a special interest, not in people who had done moving, like down the road or migrating from one country to another, not in those people, but in the people who were left behind. Okay, so step 3 is a preliminary analysis that I'm going to talk to you about using that intersection of home and moving. And we've drawn on an archaeological... Oh, gosh. Thank you. Yes, sorry. Okay, so we've drawn on an archaeological metaphor. We like this set to, I don't know if for those of you who know about archaeology, they dig a shallow test pit first before they decide where to dig deeper. So this is our shallow test pit. And you're moving on now from these from word counts, word associations, to start identifying ideas within the data. You're looking to see is there enough interest in this for us to go in deeper? You're still working with a big data set, but you're focusing down now on the parts of the data set that have the words that you're interested in. So that's your starting point. Now, there may be other words that were thrown up in the keyword analysis. I'm not sure thrown up is the right word, identified. But, so you don't leave them aside. They might be more insightful later, but at the moment you're focusing down on one in-depth analysis. So what you're doing at this stage is, because you're still working with large volumes of data, is you're doing a quick exploration of this massive volume where you've got the words that you're interested in. So you just do a small dig, if you like. You just give it a small reading of short samples of extracts of material that contain those keywords that you're interested in. So what you're looking for is to be able to make a decision about whether that material is interesting and you're going to go further to look at it. Now, it's really tempting when you do this, but if you're a qualitative researcher, you have to hold yourself back. It is so tempting to go right down into the data sets and start reading massive amounts of the interview transcript or whatever data you're dealing with. But you've got to resist. You've got to not do that. And the emphasis on this step 3 is you want to identify the places where you're going to do that depth reading, not do the depth reading. So we came up with, in the end, we were looking at extracts of data with the keywords in it that had about 200 words. And that sort of gave us a good sense of whether material was relevant to the research questions that we're pursuing. You might find when you look into those 200 words that actually, it's quite ambiguous. Lynn was talking about the way that love could be associated with I love shopping rather than I really love my children. So that you might think, no, I'm not interested in shopping. That's too ambivalent. So you also need to think back to where you're drawing data from all different sources, not just one source. You need to think back to where is this source located. So if you put together 7 different studies, as we did, conducted by other researchers, then it might be that if we identify that all of our keywords that we want to look into further in this step all come from one study, just one of the original studies. Why is that happening? If they're all from particular types of people, it's only the men in the study who spoke about this, not about the women, what's going on there? Or it's only people who live in a particular area, who live in rural areas, not in city areas, who talk in this way. So you just need to bear in mind what your data is about. Now, as I said, we wanted to dig into these test bits at this intersection of the words home and moved. And here you can see this example of the kind of extracts. We did it in Leximancer, by the way. These are the kinds of extracts that we're dealing with. So I don't know if you can read it, in the top extract, we have May Niluska talking about moving away. She was moving away up the road from her father. So no, we're not so interested in her because she's the one that's doing the moving. And in the bottom one, Marion Arthur is talking about her mother staying at home rather than going out to work. So no, those aren't so relevant. So you can see that I'm showing you ones we cut out rather than ones that we included, because we were interested in people talking about when somebody that they cared about, were intimate with, moved away from them. And then we took all the extracts that were the ones that we were interested in, and we did a reading through of all of them, and then we started categorizing them. So we identified what we called short-term cases and long cases of being moved away from. So the former very short story about being left behind, or you might have a longer term story where somebody's had lots of times where people have moved away from them, and it's more as a dominant feature of their interview. We also identified other themes like ambivalence and acceptance. We identified different temporal motions like pendulum, moving backwards and forwards between homes, like where children or siblings go away to university and then they return every so often, or someone who has constant home moves associated with employment. There's conclusive moving away, just moving away completely, such as your parents getting divorced and one of them moving away, or grandparents going into a care home. And then there's return, moving away, and then back again over a longer period of time, such as, adult children who move to be nearer to their elderly parents. And so on that basis, we identified different themes that we were going to dig into more deeply in the cases. Now, in this final stage, this is step 4, what we are doing is moving from examining those little extracts of data to a very in-depth interpretive analysis of the whole case or the whole unit of analysis. So that's our archaeological equivalent of deep excavation. Now, before I go further into this step 4, what I want you to do is turn to the person next to you and tell them or ask them about what sorts of qualitative analysis methods you have used. And then I want you to be brave and tell me them. Okay, so if you can identify some qualitative analysis methods that you have used to analyse your qualitative data. Come on, you're not students, so talk to each other, identify some, and then I'm going to ask you to feed them back to me. No, it'll be all right, yeah. No, it's okay, it's okay, yeah. Okay, I think that's enough of you. What I want now is for brave people to tell me what methods of qualitative analysis you have worked with, please. So is anybody prepared to shout one out? Narrative. Oh, actually, I should write this down, shouldn't I? Right, narrative. Anything else? Thank you.
Actually, can I try adding a slide to there?
Can I just carry on, Lynn, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry. Narrative, discourse, grounded theory. Right. Anything else? Phenomenology. Oh, sorry, phenomenographic, yes. Not phenomenology. I don't know what that is. Colysis. Oh, right.
And conversation analysis.
Any others? What analysis? Content. Thank you. Maybe I should have had them. Okay, I think that's enough of it. So there's a whole range here of different methods, aren't there? So what they all involve is this, and aspects of this process. Reading, rereading, which you couldn't do with the massive data sets, you could only do it with this, all the sort of comparing and contrasting of meanings and so on. Now, with the breadth and depth method, you select a particular case to pursue in depth, because as I've said, they hold some particular promise of meaning and insight. And you're selecting those ones to dig down into using these methods. You might choose some cases for in-depth excavation because they've got recurrent themes in them, common themes in them. You might choose some cases because they're unusual. But the process of analysis that you go through, whatever the basis you have for choosing your cases to look at in depth, the process of analysis that you go through is one that you, as qualitative researchers, are going to be comfortable with, you're going to recognise it, and you're going to value it. It's this part that qualitative researchers in particular feel uses the strengths of qualitative data because it is very sensitive to context, it's sensitive to multi-layered complexity, it focuses on rich detail and so on. So this is, when you're working with what we call big qualitative data, this is the stage where you are bringing depth into conversation with the breadth of the first steps. So there's this diversity of actual ways of working with the data that you've given me, narrative, discourse. They all answer different sorts of questions. They all illuminate in different ways social meaning, subjectivities, activities, processes, constructions, and discourses. So which one you use for this in-depth part of step 4 it's down to you. It's determined by your conceptual approach, what your substantive concerns are, and also what the pragmatics of the sort of data that's available to you are. So in the example of where we're looking at home moves and being left behind, in that example, we have been digging down into the stories, beyond those short extracts, into the stories that people are telling us that give substance to the literature. So these themes are standing up to deeper analysis, and we're looking at ambivalence and acceptance and pulling out gender differences and similarities and generational differences and similarities in our data. But overall, what the breadth and depth method does is, we hope we've given you a little taste of how it allows you to work with a massive amount in qualitative terms, a big amount of qualitative data, but you can still retain the integrity of a qualitative approach because you are still paying attention to context and richness. And if you want to find out more about the method, you can visit our project website. Okay, thanks.
So we now have some minutes for questions or comments. Please put your hand up. Okay, so maybe I can start. Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed particularly the method. And one of the questions that I would like you to consider has to do with the source of this data that you analyze. The data comes from projects in your center, or do you go and find the data elsewhere? How does that work? You need to
switch on.
yeah, just click. No, in the center.
The screen is showing you the website of the particular data's archive. This particular collection was funded by the ESRC, the main funding body in UK, with the idea of it becoming an archive from the very beginning. So it was a set of projects that were, for the first time, as far as the ESRC had funded, bringing together an archive of qualitative research that was longitudinal over time. And so it's broader than any one particular research centre. It's researchers from across the UK doing projects in different places with different generations, but all with an element of time, multiple sweeps of data, and then all archived. But you can also access it through the UK Data Archive, which is where all qualitative research that's been publicly funded ends up. And so you can search the UK Data Archive specifically for qualitative research projects in their sort of search facility, which is called Discover. And you would also get to this set of projects that way, but they have their own particular archive, which is hosted at the University of Leeds.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Just to add to that, in the United Kingdom, there's been a big move, like Lynn was saying, for any research that is publicly funded, the data has to be deposited in an archive for other researchers to use. So we took one set of projects and used them. That's basically just sort of, because I don't think archiving of other people's data for you to use is common in most countries. No.
So the data was already analyzed, so you conduct second analysis on data?
Yes, I mean, the original researchers had conducted their analysis, and then we went in and we conducted another analysis for our purposes, different research questions.
Do you mind if I just actually get you to do this left-hand, right-hand thing now? Because this will also tell us about... so, I mean, you've all done research on qualitative data, but I wonder how many people have done... so if you all put one hand up for that, but if you add a finger up, a special finger, if you've also done have you ever done secondary analysis of qualitative data? Yes, okay. So just one person in the room. What about teaching? So have you ever taught qualitative research? Yes. And what about teaching secondary analysis of qualitative research? Yes. We have at least one person. Yes, 2 people. Yep. Okay. But not many. So there's this resource there. I mean, even in most countries, although there isn't a developed archive like the UK Data Archive, there are some deposits of qualitative research. And then there's your own. Do you never wish anyone ever to look at it again?
I was thinking on that. Do you find that researchers don't like to share their data?
Though there was a whole discussion about that, as you could imagine. And some people feel, there's heated views on either side about the there's various ethical issues. There's the intellectual property right of the original researcher, but there's also the relationship the original researcher had to the people who are being researched and the ethical issues around that. And this particular data set that we were working with was obviously set up with archive in mind from the very beginning. And the permissions that were negotiated with the people who were being researched were already explaining that this was going to be the case. And indeed in the UK, for any publicly funded research, your consent form and your consent discussion with your participants has to discuss that. But yes, there was resistance. And as researchers, we like to think, I think as qualitative researchers, we often like to think that, well, basically nobody else could do, sometimes we'd argue, could never do an adequate analysis because they didn't understand the full context in which this data were collected. Only the person collecting it might understand that, but we would basically disagree with that and argue that if you document that well, which we should be doing anyway, and if you are bringing it together for slightly different purposes, but you're mindful of the original purpose and you're thinking about how the data were constructed and you are being respectful of the conditions that were put on the data and the citing the intellectual property of the original collectors, that there are honourable ways of doing this.
So how do you do it? When you use data from projects, not this one, because since the beginning it was thought and you plan to use it ahead, but how do you do to respect, like you were saying, the way that data was gathered, the purpose, etc., pragmatic way?
Well, you have to basically find out how it was gathered. You have to know that, and hopefully, if it's been well documented, that's in the public domain. And so you read what's been written about it. You read their, yeah. Go on. No, you're on, you go.
Okay, so that is step one. When you're looking, I mean, we think this method works for massive amounts of qualitative data, whether it's somebody else has collected it or you've collected or whatever. It's a way of dealing with large amounts of qualitative data. But if you're working with secondary data, step one is overviewing what is out there that is relevant and reviewing all the information about it that's available for you to then know what the context was. And I mean, if the original researchers are still alive, you could contact them, which we did, and just to tell them that you're going to be using their data and ask them about any issues that they think might be relevant.
So questions, okay, we have 1, 2.
Can I?
Okay, so yeah,
Okay.
over here.
I don't know if it's it's on. Okay. I think I'm quite confused about secondary data and documental data, because I've been working with documental data and especially with the text of environmental agreements from United Nations, and this is a kind of data that anybody can reach and analyze, and we can compare the analysis and all those things. And for this kind of data, the method that you both showed is it applies very well, and it's kind of this that we do, but in the step 4 we applied critical discussion analysis. But also I used secondary data collected by an agency, coincidentally it's from UK. I think we have some entities that collect massive data from internet that we can ask them to collect specific data sets for us. And one of the problems that I found in my research was to try to understand they made a sample to send to us, and to try to understand the criteria that they used to make the sample. And these make a bias. Sorry for my English, it's not that good, but it make a biased colocou bias, our analysis. And so sometimes I'd like that you talk a little bit more about document. You said it's very well documented, it's easier to work with data, but maybe we can discuss a little bit more about this. What is documental data, and what's secondary data, and what is necessary to have a good analysis, not biased.
Okay, so, you know, we're qualitative researchers. Labels of get fuzzy, don't they? But I would say that one way of thinking about it is that data it's research data that is collected specifically for research, and then it's analysed secondarily by another set of researchers or by the same researcher revisiting their own data for another purpose. Documentary data is like a byproduct of for researchers are using as a product of another purpose. So when you are working with documents from an organisation, they weren't produced for you as a researcher. They were produced for the organisation, and then you'd use them as data as a researcher. Sorry?
It's a primary data.
No,
right?
this is where the fuzziness is, in terms of you are using it for secondary purpose, but it isn't secondary data in and of itself in that way. But I you know, I'm not. Don't kill me for this definition. You know, I don't know if you want to. No. Okay, so, and then in terms of bias, that I don't like the word bias in in these samples, but the thing is to be aware of how what the source of the data is, what's been included within it, what's outside of it, and then you take that into account in your analysis. So it's like I was saying about if your keyword analysis is, if you've got 7 data sets, you've put them together, but your keyword analysis is throwing up words from just one data set, that would be bias in your terms. You'd need to think about, why is this happening? What am I asking that doesn't apply widely? Yeah.
I just wanted to say that when I was talking about generalizability, so one of the things that often gets thrown at us as qualitative researchers is about the small sample size and the specificity. So we usually, for good theoretical reasons, are choosing very particular samples. But if you're bringing together a constellation of data from multiple small samples, you often then are able to say, well, it wasn't just white, middle class, it was also this group and this group and this group. And it doesn't mean, as I said, any kind of statistical generalizability, like just because you've now got, say, 1,000 instead of 10, it doesn't work like that. It cannot work like that, because it's not a big random sample. It's not representative of anything in that sense, but nevertheless, you are across more conditions and can say something about process and meaning across more conditions.
Thank you. We have another question. Yeah, please go.
Just to say thank you for sharing approaches. I really like this approach and can see huge value both in terms of strengthening the credibility and the transferability. My question, and perhaps it's more from a grounded theory perspective where we're looking at using a constant comparison method, is have you found when you've used it, the process is more cyclical rather than linear, that when you get perhaps to the in-depth stage, you find something interesting that you hadn't originally identified, perhaps in the, I think you described it as the shallow dig stage, and go back to do another keyword search and kind of work the process around again. Have you used it in that way or found that that's useful?
You want to go?
We haven't done that, but we think that the method has that built into it, that iterative ability built into it, but we haven't actually done that as such. Do you know, it took us, because of all the cleaning of the data and getting it all into a corpus, and then working with different sort of packages to look at the keyword, it's taken us 3 years to get to this state. It is not quick and easy. We're hoping to make it quicker and easier for other people, but we haven't actually. We're in the process of doing the step 4, as I tried to show you with the home and moving one, but we haven't actually sort of quite finished it to be going back. But hopefully the potential is there, that there is that iterative approach, which is that constant comparison. Yeah.
So I get that you use different softwares doing the analysis. Why is that?
Well, we wanted to try out different softwares because we're doing this as a kind of demonstration of the method. So, and also, well, we're not, we're not super, we're not computer programmers, or, some sociologists and social scientists of different backgrounds are more computer literate than others. Well, I'm not a complete ignoramus, but I'm at the lower end, right? I don't want to invest the time learning R or Python, but actually I do think those open source programs are basically maybe the way to go. So I've been working with someone who is more skilled in R, to try to look at things. But we've also been using an off-the-shelf piece of software that claims to be able to find themes in data called Leximancer, but it's not completely transparent. And here at this conference, there are people who, would advocate for other softwares. And I've also played with AntConc, which is a very basic completely free linguistics package that does the text searches and so on. So I've also myself used that, which is very similar to Wordsmith, which some people might have used. So we've just been trying out different things to see how we go. But all of that, of course, takes time.
Okay, so we have time for one final question. No? Okay, so thank you so much, Lynn, Rosalind, for your presentation. Very interesting, and I'm sure that we will all be curious to learn how your method goes. And please keep us informed regarding the developments. Thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch.